Welcome back. Starting a new unit today. This one's on drug and substance abuse among adolescents. We're going to look at the first part today. We're going to look at, next video lecture, we're going to look at more controlled substances such as marijuana, cocaine, hallucinogens, and things of that sort among adolescents. This is going to be more introductory, and we're going to focus on the abuse of one particular substance, alcohol. So today we're going to look at some of the motivations for adolescents to use drugs. And while this is not to encourage or to rationalize or justify the use of drugs, I think it's more helpful if we look at, that the adolescents are not mentally insane, they're not crazy, this is not irrational behavior, but there are some reasons why they might be drawn to different types of substance abuses as a way of kind of understanding and also helping combating the problem. We're going to look a little bit about the history and kind of changes in drug use over time among adolescents. And finally, we're going to focus on alcohol, both what it does to the adolescent brain, but also some of the maybe the profiles of someone who's more likely to abuse alcohol. Let's begin by looking at a roadmap. As I was saying before, we're going to start looking at why adolescents use drugs. What are some of the motivations, and not just in the sense that they enjoy them, but there might be some other social and psychological reasons why they might be drawn to substance abuse. We're going to look at what's changed over time, and how does alcohol fit into the overall substance abuse picture. And alcohol is kind of different because in many ways alcohol is legal in general, but it is restricted by age. And so alcohol in some ways shares things with other types of controlled substances in terms of addictive behaviors, in terms of its impact upon the brain, impact on general society and the fatality rate because of alcohol abuse. At the same time, it's something that has a cultural place in society going back millennia, and in some sense that is legal, at least for adults to use, and therefore there's this kind of alcohol as a rite of passage, but alcohol is something that's forbidden right during the adolescent age and changes shortly after. And so it might be a little bit different than some of the other types of substances that are banned wholesale. So why do adolescents tend to abuse drugs? One, I think, is that very common that you see is stress and tension relief, which means that people tend to do it as a kind of an answer to nervous habits. They tend to do it when they are tense, particularly like when they're feeling pressure, or they're feeling academic pressure, social pressure, maybe pressure in terms of situations such as athletics or performance. And using drugs is a way for them to reduce their tension and to reduce frustration, maybe to sometimes to relieve boredom in the sense that they have nothing to do, and so drugs are kind of a habit that fills in, let's say, some of those spaces. Sometimes you see, and this is very more and more common, is fatigue, where drugs get used, particularly amphetamines, and you see students, adolescents today drink, energy drinks that have a lot of packed with amphetamines, caffeine, and things of that sort, because they feel they have to stay awake, they have to be on top of it. Coffee drinking is much more common today than it would have been in the past, into the excesses that put into where you might be concerned about the consumption of caffeine. Second one is just simple, like they enjoy it. That drugs are an enjoyable experience. They enjoy whatever pharmacological reaction that the drugs induce, whether that's kind of a sedated state, a relaxed state, whether it's kind of more energy and exciting, sort of exhilaration. And the point is that they just physically like what the drug is doing to your body, and if you like something, you're going to do it more. And this is mostly focusing on what chemically does the drug does to the body, and the enjoyment of those states. Not that drugs always produce those states, but the idea that it could, and it's a source of pleasure just like anything else. Why do people eat lots of sugar? Because the sugar is sweet and it tastes good. One that I think that is sometimes underplayed, but I think is particularly important to adolescents, is curiosity. Drugs are often something, in some ways they have similarities to the idea of sex, that it's something that they see adults doing. It's something that they see as forbidden. There's a lot of rumors, false information about it. And there's a wonderment of whether this is true or not. Like, okay, it's bad, but how bad? I see other people enjoying it, maybe they're wrong. And so I think what leads to a lot of drug use is just curiosity, which is, I've never been drunk before, what is that like? I've never used this drug before, people say that it's a good experience, maybe they're correct. And kind of the idea that they're just, test tasting something, or the idea that, if they don't like it, they don't have to use it, and they don't have to make it habitual. And also the belief that maybe using drugs a little bit is not as harmful, that it's really people who are addicted and take large quantities of drugs that is the problem. And so curiosity, when they do surveys among adolescents, when they ask them why do you use, or what made you start using a drug, very often they cite curiosity as one of their major reasons. I think sometimes you see this in terms of vaping, which is just like, I just want to be able to know what it is, rather than reject it without using it. And I think, that's a big part with adolescents, where older people who might have more experience or know people who have used drugs, the curiosity is not as important as a motivation. And the last reason, and this is the reason for many types of behaviors for adolescents, which is just a social reason, that there's peer pressure, they feel more comfortable, particularly people with social anxiety, that the using of drugs, it makes them more comfortable in the situation. It also is, if they see other people doing it, they feel like it's something they have to do to belong in a particular social set, and it allows them to enjoy the company of others. And I mean, from drinking alcohol because it's a party and alcohol is being served, to people who smoke marijuana or other things together, there's an idea of like fellowship, or doing something collectively and sharing that experience. And one of the things about this is that, there are certain drugs that I think tend to get abused privately and individually, where people go into hiding because they don't want to be seen using the drug. And usually there's an embarrassment or a shame about using it, versus that situations where using drugs is very social, which means that doing it by yourself defeats the whole purpose. And so different types of drugs, different types of individuals and adolescents, but the pressure to belong is very strong among adolescents, and so that can be another kind of independent factor that creates a motivation to use drugs. So just looking at a recent survey asking 12th graders why they began vaping, and you see here one of the most consistent reasons that they gave from 2015 to last year is experimentation, to see what it's like. So that's kind of goes into the curiosity reason that we talked about in the previous slide. The second most one, because it tastes good. And obviously, the thing with vaping is flavors, and everyone can choose their own flavors, so it's not like everyone's having the same experience. So that's kind of the feel-good one. The third one we see, and I think what's interesting about this is that this is increasing, and this might be because vaping is becoming more common, that it became for something that was kind of on the margins and very few people were using it, to something that people are doing with other people. And certainly I think that fits my own experience with students using it, is that they don't tend to do it by themselves, they tend to do it in groups. And so this is kind of the social reason to have a good time with the friends. And then you see kind of a lot of the other small reasons, which you could, some of them would fit into the idea of relieving tension, or boredom, or to deal with a social problem or a social pressure or feeling of frustration. So you can see at the end, some of it is kind of a trade-off with using cigarettes, where cigarettes are perceived to be dangerous, certainly more today than they were in the past, and vaping is seen as a safe alternative. As an adult, that seems kind of illogical to me, but the idea is that vaping, both tobacco can be bad, but also vaping is certainly bad, and I've seen experiences with both of them. So this leads to the problem is usually that the idea is that you become dependent on a drug and that it has addictive behavior. There's a lot of studies of addiction, and some people have tied it to genetics, some people have seen addictive kind of personality complexes, and some of this is just that there are substances that are physically addictive. And so I think we need to separate between physical addiction and psychological addiction. The physical addiction is that there's something that creates like a physical need or a hunger or a hankering for, that if you don't have it, or let's say you take a drug, you kind of get a craving for it, and when you stop taking it, the withdrawal symptoms are unpleasant, and withdrawal symptoms create a physical reaction, and it makes it very hard to quit. So the idea is that someone who's not using or using a substance might not have that physical dependence, but someone who has started or someone who's tried it might not have the ability. And this kind of combines also with kind of the building of tolerance, that you start taking a relatively little and controllable amount, And then that doesn't get produce the same high, and therefore people kind of up their dosages or up, what they are buying, and they become more and more, in a sense, more tolerant. Therefore, they need a larger dose. Therefore, they become more physically dependent, and eventually to the point where it's very hard to break free from the drug's use. It ceases to become like, let's say, a rational or choice, where people can just, in a sense, make a decision. But what's more common with a lot of drugs is a psychological dependence, which means that it's not really the drug itself, it is the emotions that people associate with the drug, which means the euphoria, sometimes if it's done socially, the friendliness, the kind of reduction in stress, and the idea that it becomes part of your routine. And the point is, what is there if I'm not doing this? And I think psychological dependence, particularly because it's hard to measure, and because it's really on self-reports, it's kind of harder to, like, say, establish a psychological dependence. But I think people who have experienced any type of addiction understand how strong a psychological dependence can be, and it's hard to break the circle that you go through, because it's in itself, it's logical, self-contained, and self-reinforcing. What I mean by that is that once you believe something, it kind of repeats it and becomes stronger in kind of an echo chamber that you create about it. And so psychological dependence, people sometimes think that because there is no chemical or physical dependence, that the substance is relatively safe, and most people credit themselves as having more willpower and control than proves to be correct. And so people tend to dismiss psychological dependence, thinking that it's something that happens to other people who might be weaker, or people not mentally strong. And I think this is kind of becomes a trap for people because they think it's something that happens to other people and not themselves. So let's look a little bit at the history and the evolution of this. Uh, Drug use has gone back, particularly if you want to include alcohol use in this, is basically goes back millennia. Drugs have been used in different cultures. Drugs have been used in different religious rituals, going back to the dawn of civilization. However, partly because of availability, partly because of the pharmacological revolution of the 20th century, you start to see a lot more drugs in the last 100, 150 years, at least in common use. So marijuana, certainly stimulants like amphetamines, cocaine, caffeine, etc., hallucinogens like LSD, were kind of become drugs of choice. And partly I think this reflects a kind of a changing in social mores and kind of a celebration of experimentation, that the social kind of I'm going to say disruption of the late 1960s, early 1970s made more people willing to be experimental, and therefore you see that kind of a shift where alcohol abuse was something that was associated more with adults, that you see it moving down the age group to adolescents during this period as well. Now, this wasn't because wasn't drug use before. I think that in the, let's say, 1900s to 1950s, you certainly saw kind of a pattern of alcohol abuse, and certainly that goes back well into the 1800s, where people were fighting the destructive, let's say, influence of alcohol use. I think that what you see in the 1960s and 1970s is that the pattern of alcohol abuse among adults kind of became not the only game in town, and you start to see a variety of other drugs being used and being introduced. So alcohol has always been, let's say, available, and therefore always been abused. The other drugs, I think, became more available because of the increase in pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical production, and in a sense, maybe social awareness of the different types of things out there, and at least maybe a social kind of norm of experimentation. In the 1980s, I think you saw a decline in drug and alcohol use, at least from the 1960s and 70s. At least in terms of, let's say, what you might want to call the 1960s and 1970s drugs. I think marijuana became less used. I think LSD became less used. And I think this is partially a reaction to the Just Say No campaigns spearheaded by Nancy Reagan. But also I think that it became more obvious the impacts that drugs were having on people. And I think there was kind of a social learning going on, that people understood that there was a downside to some of the drugs that were used commonly in the 1960s and 70s, and people basically moved off from them. I think what the other thing that happened during the 1980s is, particularly with Heroin and some other drugs is the AIDS epidemic, and the AIDS spreading through people, the social using of things like drug paraphernalia, particularly heroin needles, scared people away from using certain types of drugs. So anything that required kind of a common, like a bong or an injection of a needle or something where there was perhaps a germ transfer became less desirable because of that. And people became aware. However, as someone who grew up during this time, the late 1980s, particularly in the Hudson Valley and New York City and cities on the East Coast, you did see an explosion of the crack cocaine epidemic, particularly in poor urban neighborhoods, and the trafficking associated with that. Now, this is something, a different drug. A lot of the drugs mentioned above were more kind of, let's say, mellow drugs or sedatives, while what you saw in the 1980s was kind of a prevalence of amphetamine, stimulants. People took drugs in a sense to get a high rather than kind of in a sense to mellow. I would say in the early 1990s, you first of all saw a huge decline in drugs, and I think you saw this because there was kind of the idea of being what they called at the time being straight edge and not putting anything unnatural into your body. But I think what you saw in the late 1990s is that you saw a return to marijuana, partly because I think these are the children of the 1960s and 70s. I think that there were a lot of adolescents who had parents who grew up in the 1960s and 70s who had used marijuana themselves, and therefore it became normalized, and there less became like a generational criticism of drug use, at least certain types of drugs. And then I think what you saw a kind of increase in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, but also I think that the taboo that people had, particularly on marijuana, decreased. And so what you saw is an increase in drug and alcohol use. Although in the 1990s, I mean, my own sense of this is that alcohol use was much greater than the 1980s. During the 1990s, what I saw a lot of people, particularly at the high school and college, is that coffee use increased and alcohol use decreased. That people were much more likely to go to a coffee house than to a bar. They're drugs in themselves, but the point is that the idea of going to a bar and drinking cheap alcohol in large quantities, I would say, decreased during this time. At least it became something more of less attractive to adolescents. Not that they weren't doing other things; it just means that particular substance abuse was less. One other thing about this is that the United States has one of the highest rates of adolescent drug use in any developed country around the world. In my own experience working with the Japanese police is that in Japan, there's a lot of drugs you don't see at all, and they have somewhat different regulation of that. You see, generally drugs are seen as things being used by foreigners, so a lot of stimulants, party drugs, LSD, cocaine, marijuana. They're used mostly in, I want to say, where Japanese society mixes with foreign neighborhoods and large metropolises like Tokyo, but not very much out of that. The drug that gets abused the most are amphetamines or stimulants. A lot of that has to do, I think, with the stress and kind of the test-taking culture and a lot of other types of things of that sort, and a way of, basically for people to stay awake and alert longer. The other thing, though, about Japan is that there were some things that were not regulated, so they wouldn't regulate anything that was quote-unquote natural. So hallucinogenic mushrooms for a long time were legal in Japan, and you would see them being sold quite out in the open with no sanction because they were considered a natural product and therefore not regulated, meaning natural versus artificial or manufactured and engineered. This is not true today, that this changed, but the point is that it wasn't because there was such a social restriction or pressure on it. It was just seen that it wasn't something that was attractive. And while marijuana is legal in certain European countries, it's not so much of a rite of passage as it is in the United States. Now, part of this I think has to do with American kind of cultural thing where it's either 100% taboo or 100% license. While I think in most European countries there's more of a sliding scale, and I think the best way to see this is in terms of alcohol use, where in a lot of European societies, alcohol is consumed at a very young age, but you rarely see people who are drunk. Same thing I would say in Japan is that drinking is very common in Japan, but it's very, very unusual to see anyone publicly drunk. And that's because people tend not to drink alone. People tend to have a system where they don't drive themselves. Um, and also the idea is that they tend to uh, there's a culture or kind of a civilization around drinking. That means that you don't drink to get drunk, you drink uh, smaller quantities. And so what you'll see in some countries is that they will water down their alcohol to reduce the alcohol content. While that's not the case in the United States, where you see a lot of, let's say, high alcohol content being more common, and also people drinking much larger volumes, meaning that there is a culture of drinking to get drunk as opposed to drinking uh, as part of their cuisine or food or things of that sort. And I think that has something to do with, let's say, the syndrome of alcohol substance abuse in the United States. So just kind of illustrate some of the changes, and this is shows you kind of marijuana use, and it's gives you from the mid 1970s up to 2010. And they ask questions like, during the past year, did you use marijuana out of high school seniors? And as you see, like, it was very high in the late 1970s, and you saw that it declined through the 1980s, kind of nadering in the early 1990s. And I think this is, as I was talking about a straight edge culture, the idea that you wouldn't want to put anything unnatural. And my own memory of high school is that, and I don't think this was just myself and my own friends, is that marijuana had basically not disappeared, but I think partly it was the fear of other drugs. This is a time where the crack cocaine epidemic had been a recent memory. People had a clear idea of the destructiveness of crack cocaine to the social fabric, and that kind of translated to other drugs, even if didn't have the same effect. And so what I think you see here is that the perceived risk of using marijuana increases dramatically during this time. So the people's perceived risk of the problems of marijuana were highest in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and then declined. And then you kind of see kind of a stable, kind of a plateau of use, but also a plateau of the perceived risk. And so I think the point is that what drove a lot of marijuana use is kind of how people perceived it, how risky it was. And when people didn't perceive it as risky, people tended to consume more. And when they thought of it being risky, they consumed it less. And so what you're seeing is kind of a social learning dynamic going on. But there are ways, let's say, where I think some drugs become more common in certain generations than others, and other drugs disappear. So I'm going to talk about the last topic, which is alcohol use. And alcohol is kind of difficult because, as I said, it's a legal drug but age restricted. I think alcohol has been identified as a problem. Obviously, in our country, we had prohibition that banned its use, but this was based on understanding that alcohol was thought to be damaging to families and destructive to productive individuals. And seeing the saloon as kind of a center of dissolute behavior. So it's a very potent drug. It's a depressant, and it kind of basically what it does, it slows down your brain's activity and slows down a lot of things like metabolism, which is the main reason why they say that you shouldn't drink if you are taking certain types of medication, because the depressant effect of alcohol combined or interacting with the depressant effect of some other drugs could slow your metabolism, slow your brain down to the point where you might get organ failure or organs might stop. Obviously, and that's even if you're not, let's say, binging or, in a sense, overwhelming your system to process the alcohol, which means is that the interactive effect with other things that might be in your body. The other thing, of course, is that when people binge drink, they might overwhelm their liver and kidneys, and this can lead to long-term damage to those organs, leading to things like cirrhosis of the liver or kidney failure. And I have a sibling who early in college was taking a cold medication and also went out drinking, and basically he had both of his kidneys shut down because of use and had to be rushed to the hospital. So my point about this is that I think that it's not alcohol in isolation, is that alcohol interacts with other things that might be in your system, and those can have much, let's say, more damaging effects. And so it has the ability to damage and kill biological tissue, and then if you consume so much, basically it paralyzes some of your cell's ability to process that it can impair your judgment in terms of your brain, your reflexes will slow down, and you might lose in essence some muscle control. And a lot of like let's say sobriety tests for some of these things. So one of the things that they often test is what's called proprioception, which is your ability to know the orientation of your body when you're not actually directly monitoring that. So when you close your eyes, most sober people have no problem touching a finger to the tip of their nose because even with your eyes closed, you know where the position of your nose is and the movement of your limbs. But when you are drunk, you're less likely to do that. Same thing with walking on a line or picking up change off the ground. Your ability to coordinate and your sense of your orientation are certainly compromised when you're not sober. Another thing is that it tends to reduce inhibition, so you see people become more talkative, they became more confident, things that are not funny become funny, or you think that your jokes are better than others, you lose your fear of social judgment. And this might explain why alcohol is often, used or misused as a social lubricant. It obviously, as we know, it impairs your ability to operate machinery and driving. As someone who has volunteered in EMS, I can tell you that one of the things you see all the time is, alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents, and sometimes it's not a car hitting a car, but it's one car hitting a tree, or people's reflexes slowing down, or inability to drive in somewhat hazardous conditions, such as icing on the roads, which most mature drivers can manage, but not when your reaction time and your perception time is compromised. So it is still most common among adolescents, and because it's most common, it is also one of the largest killers. Tens of thousands of individuals killed every year by drunk drivers, and many, many more millions injured. And I think that people tend to look only at the people killed by alcohol, and they really should have a broader view of this, because modern medicine has allowed people to survive a lot of accidents that would have killed them in the past. But the injuries are gruesome, and almost every single year that I've been a teacher, which is almost 20 years now, I've had at least one student who has been seriously injured or killed because of alcohol and driving. And I mention it every year. I would like to break this pattern. I don't think it has anything to do with me, but the point is that it leads to a lot of preventable deaths. What it also does, and partly because of the increasing confidence, it's also very often related to aggressive male acts, so as violence against women, date abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse tends to be much more common, or alcohol is present in a lot of these cases, probably because impairment of judgment, increasing confidence, maybe an inability to understand social cues, but also might as like a difficulty in perception and impairment of judgment leads to more offensive these things. And generally I would never go drinking, and I would not counsel anyone to go drinking unless you had a friend who was sober, who would kind of act as kind of a gatekeeper for you to make sure that you don't get yourself into situations, because these situations tend to increase. And as part of kind of the social interaction, it happens perhaps a little bit more than it should. So what we have found through brain scans of people who have abuse of alcohol, but also use of alcohol, is that it's damaged the hippocampus, and this is what's involved in learning and memory. And what these experiments often just ask people to locate objects on the screen, or to remember where they were. So they show them an image. And they have control groups, and the ones that have some alcohol influence are less likely to identify the location, and so their memory is involved. And so you can see this particularly as a teacher, that when someone has an alcohol issue, their ability to perform simple academic tasks is somewhat compromised, particularly in terms of like ability to, it's not so much the slurring of words or the inability to do things, it's that their memory is compromised and they seem not to always be with it. So what are some of the risk factors that can be related to alcohol abuse? As we understand genetics, we understand that hereditary is a bigger part of this than people think that particularly that people have addictive behaviors, and this is sometimes related to family influences. Family influences and family structures, so that if you have alcohol in your family, or particularly you have maybe a tradition of alcohol abuse in your family, where if you see people drink to get drunk, and I think this is not just at the family level, but also at the society and the cultural level, where people have rituals where people drink to get drunk, you tend to see, let's say, more alcohol abuse. It can be related to sometimes peer relations and personality characteristics, so people who feel social pressure or they need social anxiety and they drink to enable themselves to operate in certain social situations. And lastly, the transitions where you find new friends, that it's very stressful to create new friends. So when people leave high school and enter college, drinking becomes one of those part of the meeting new people. And you see, particularly among college freshmen, a huge amount of alcohol abuse, and the inability to process this. Now, I think part of this is also just when you have authority figures are out of the picture because people are away at college or in dorm rooms, and there's less supervision in freshman and sophomore year of college. Combined with the curiosity and the social pressures, you see alcohol abuse becoming more common. Some characteristics of adolescent alcohol abusers is that they tend to, as it kind of fits into the idea that alcohol is a tension reliever, is that when people have unhappy homes and there's a lot of, in a sense, disruption, there's a lot of times where people are angry and fighting, alcohol use gets used more. You can also see in terms of parents who are absent or parents that don't provide, let's say, certain types of structure, or at least in a sense provide other opportunities for activities, meaning some type of social engagement that is not alcohol related, becomes more common. Very often, everyone can judge other people's parents' decisions, but when you have alcohol available or unlocked or easy to access to people who are underage, when you have adults who are not in the household, and therefore it leads to things like people having parties or abusing alcohol while the adults are away. When there's no, in a sense, reinforcement of positive behaviors, people just say, look, sometimes I run into several students who I think the simplest explanation of their behavior is that they drank as a way of getting attention, that they wanted to fail or do something antisocial. And when they didn't reward for positive activities, they went for negative attention. And with parents either sanction, meaning they approve alcohol use or not. And just to talk about my own dynamic on this is that I have a father who regularly drinks at dinner, a glass of wine. He's from Italian background, and it's part of the culture of the alcohol is to be combined, but he only drinks when he's having dinner. And I have a mother who never drinks at all. And so in my family, you see very difference by kind of some people having basically being teetotalers, meaning they don't use alcohol at all, and some who have alcohol but have it kind of in a regulated way. How parents use alcohol kind of sets a pattern for how adolescents use alcohol, and this is part of their curiosity, but part of, let's say, the modeling that happens from adults to teenagers. And some people are more susceptible to peer pressure, and if there's peer pressure to drink, you might see more alcohol use among adolescents with that profile. So they found several different types of 10th grade adolescent drinkers. So ones that have high problem behaviors might be correlated to, let's say, certain types of parenting that also lead to more problem behaviors. So people who are seen as, engaged in antisocial behaviors, or people who are anti-authoritarian. You might see this a lot. You can see this in anxious individuals, so kind of performance anxiety and social anxiety you see. And then you see kind of like among popular, well-functioning adolescents who belong to groups, and they see as part of the social kind of dynamics, which means, you go to a party, you drink. And so that you kind of see three different types, one who are kind of antisocial, ones who are hypersocial, and ones who are experiencing social anxiety. Another study by Robert Cloninger found that the traits that are associated with adolescents who abuse alcohol, ones who are usually bored. So this is kind of the idea that alcohol kind of creates a routine, and drinking becomes part of that routine, and it leads to activity and stimulation. There are ones that crave reward for their effort. meaning like people who are not, in a sense, getting the social, in a sense, the positive reinforcement. This can lead to sometimes more alcoholism, and then ones who are negative consequences, and so they're using alcohol as kind of as a way of avoiding or eluding reality. So, some concluding thoughts. I think that there are some studies that suggest alcohol use is down among adolescents. Some of the people say this is because the social dynamics are different now than they used to be in the past. People tend to socialize at home. They tend to socialize virtually. And therefore, they're not going out into places where they're not being observed and where alcohol can be consumed outside of adult supervision, but also that you don't have, let's say, the party at a large group of adolescents at one person's house type of party that you might have seen in the past. And what you're more likely to see is a lot of individuals communicating online, but physically separate. And therefore, alcohol. And I think what part of this is that people are able to select peer groups where they feel more comfortable, and there's less, let's say, threatening and pressure because you can turn off the transmission, and as a result, alcohol is less necessary because there are situations that don't create the same social anxiety or the peer pressure that you might have, and so alcohol might be something that is changing. I think also that what you're seeing is kind of maybe a rotation to a different type of substance abuse, but we'll talk more about that in the next video lecture. So that is all for now, and I will see you next time.